Starmer, good Lord, I'm surprised that the English population hasn't at least risen up and done away with him. That may yet happen. The situation in the West is very fragile. There have been attempts for the last 50 years to create what people referred to as an EU army. They even stood up an EU headquarters. It was designed to be like the NATO deployable, and it failed. It just has gone nowhere because until this point in time, Judge, no one in authority in Europe has been willing to invest any money in any of the critical capabilities, not just weapons, but also command and control. And they've been unwilling to adapt to new technology in any way. So these are empty threats. And I think that's why you've seen President Trump has largely ignored it, which he should.
In the meantime, we poured billions and billions into Ukraine for the purpose of building up what turned out to be the largest army in NATO. By the time the Russians went into Ukraine, you had almost 800,000 men under arms in Ukraine. They had some of the best equipment and weaponry that you could get. And they had ostensibly, in retrospect, the enormous benefit of American military leadership and strategy, and secondarily British military leadership and strategy, which is a hell of a note, frankly, since it's been catastrophic for Ukraine. But the point is, President Trump might also think about taking his own advice when it comes to size and numbers. He was talking about Zelensky. Zelensky was promised by us that he would win because we would stand behind him and provide him with everything that we could. That was always a dangerous promise and not one that was likely to be fulfilled. We went into this tariff war on the basis of the assumption of people like Navarro, presumably Lutnick, that foreign capital would then flow into our markets. It's not flowing in. The bond market is a disaster. Right. If we're not careful, it's going to hit 5%. When that happens, we lose everything because the Japanese and the Chinese and others are dumping our treasuries. All of this is going on, and yet President Trump continues to vacillate between I want peace, but I'm going to continue to pretend to do these other things or do these other things because, and the reason for that was very simple. We were not colonialists. We were not imperialists. And they viewed us as fair and just people. I don't think the people of Syria or anywhere else in the Muslim world would want Americans on their soil ever, based upon what we've seen over the last 30 years. In 1914, when war broke out, the British and the French ambassadors met immediately, and they both said the same thing to each other. The one person in Berlin who is most unhappy about this war is the Kaiser, because we all know war was the last thing he wanted. Stop and consider that we've learned a couple of very important things over the last few years. Number one, that our equipment, our organization, our tactics don't work on the battlefield that exists today. We live in a different world. We have a battlefield, or a battle space, as people like to call it, that has changed dramatically. And number two, that all U.S. personnel in and out of uniform, intelligence, civilian, doesn't make any difference, would leave Ukraine within 48 hours. Had he done that, then this would not be his war, but he did the opposite. And effectively, what he's done since he's been in there is largely extend Biden policies. So now he owns it. President Trump has to be an effective leader at this point. That means that Zelensky's got to go. He's got to do the things that we've discussed. When you listen to Zelensky talk about what he demands of Russia, it's very similar to Mr. Netanyahu's demand for the Libyan solution for Iran. Netanyahu and Zelensky are of one mind. They both want the same thing, the complete and utter destruction of their opponents as a precondition for future peace and stability. So it's Zelensky's version of the Libyan solution. Now we've got the Netanyahu-Libyan solution waiting in the wings. Fortunately, I think President Trump stands a chance of getting out of Ukraine if he makes a decision. Again, he's the commander-in-chief. Everything is at his discretion. All of the aid going into Ukraine is at his discretion. Congress voted for it, but he has the ability, the authority to halt it at any point in time he chooses. And again, he's got to understand that he's not going to end up being popular with everybody. One of the things that I think President Trump wants to be is popular with everyone. That's not going to happen. It's never been the case for. And secondly, that we have to impose a solution, because if we don't, we look weak. And this is back to the question of how do we get a win for the boss? Wait a minute. This is not UFC night. This is not a college basketball match. This is life and death for millions of people at the moment in Ukraine. But if we're not careful, this could spread, not because of anything that President Putin wants to do, but because of the stupids who are ruling in Paris and London and Berlin. They could cause it to expand. And of course, that would be delightful for the fools.
There's a reason why after the Germans conquered most of Europe by 1940, that we did not land until June of 1944, because it took all of those intervening years to wear down the German military machine on multiple fronts. But you're not doing any of that against the Chinese, and the Chinese are a much more difficult proposition. They're the largest fortress in the world. So you're taking on something from the sea and the air that you have no chance of fundamentally damaging and changing. The problem is the bombings haven't had the desired effect on the people on the ground in Yemen. They remain defiant. They seem to have survived these horrendous bombings. They still seem to be able to manufacture much of their own equipment, including missiles. They have access to satellite intelligence, probably via Iran, but potentially from Europe, Russia, elsewhere. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I think the president...
But President Trump needs to re-examine the wisdom of waging a tariff war or an economic war on China that is infinitely larger and whose markets are frankly increasingly broader and deeper than our own. So we're in the same position now vis-a-vis China as Zelensky is with Russia. The British ruling class, of which this man is not a member but a spokesman, is very much in bed with the Wolfowitzes and the Pearls and others of that ilk and Victoria Nuland, who want to live in a world where you have permanent enemies and permanent allies. But we know from history those permanent allies never last. This alliance should have gone out of existence back in the early 1990s. This NATO business is irrelevant. They liked what they had because they didn't have to invest heavily in their own defense. And the British in particular love NATO because they can populate the senior ranks of NATO and the headquarters with disproportionate numbers of people who are British in order to move Europe in the direction they want it to go. It was a joke when I was in SHAPE headquarters. You turn around and you couldn't walk down the hall without tripping over a British officer. Now, I like many of these people, but the problem is no one in the region other than Israel can be permitted to have a nuclear weapon. That's what this is about. Israel has over 300 weapons, immense destructive power that can be launched from air, missile, or sea. And no one in the region has any nuclear weapons. And what everyone in the region knows is that you must not have any because having any threatens Israel. Now, what are we talking about with Israel? Well, we're talking about something much more than the defense of Israel. The defense of Israel went out the window back over a year ago when this event on the 7th of October, and we've talked about that before. I am absolutely skeptical of the notion that this was something that happened without the Israelis knowing about it and reacting to it. Complete nonsense. They're too competent, and they had that place under excellent surveillance. I don't believe that for a minute. But the narrative is we were attacked on 7 October, and this horrific attack is now justification for us to effectively dominate the whole region because we in Israel will not be safe until everyone is subjugated. And that's just what I described. But this has always been a problem for him because he surrounds himself with people who give him reasons to act against his system, against his own instincts. Let me tell you, back in April of 2022, I received a call from Mar-a-Lago, and a voice at the other end said, "What do you think about Ukraine and what's happening there?" This was probably the first week of April 2022. I said, "This thing's a catastrophe. We need to stop it immediately." This started, you and I talked about this before the election, after the election, and have continued to talk about it. Suspend all support for Zelensky and this criminal regime, the most corrupt, one of the most, if not the most corrupt country in the world, where the population is being ruthlessly exploited by its own government and millions of lives are lost and destroyed as a result, all unnecessarily. So he's got to make some profound changes. He needs to do it very quickly. Get rid of these people. If he doesn't, then he's going to be standing on the bridge of the Titanic, waving to the few people on lifeboats that were smart enough to get off. Number one, we've discussed this before. And then you get all of the Americans who are in Ukraine out. Trump quite recently said, this is not my war, this is Biden's war. Wrong. It's your war now, President Trump. You haven't taken the decisive action to distance yourself from this disaster. So here we sit, and nothing concrete or fundamental has occurred. I think the president, frankly, is a little confused. This is a much more complex, complicated matter than apparently he realizes. This whole business was a function of NATO expansion from the beginning. And President Putin has been saying for years, over and over again, don't push this envelope. We don't want NATO on our borders. If it shows up, so I'm sure the man's telling the truth. Go back to Bucha. Remember Bucha? Oh, the Russians have done this. They tied people's hands behind their back, shot them through the heads, then they threw the bodies in the streets and piled them up in the cellars. It's all nonsense. We know that now. It's absolute lie. Let's just move on. This is a lot of nonsense. There's something that's even more important. In April, I received a phone call this is April of 2022. I received a phone call from Mar-a-Lago, and the individual on the other end said, we're interested in what you think about Ukraine. And I said, sure. I said, the first thing to consider is that the Ukraine war needs to end immediately. We should negotiate an end to this. I don't think General Kellogg's audience is in Moscow. I think his audience is in Western Europe, the three capitals that I mentioned earlier. And he's got a big audience back here in Washington, D.C. These are foolish people that think that somehow or another we and the world and Europe will all benefit from sustaining this conflict. And there's just no evidence for that. The conflict is destructive. It's harming everyone.
On the other hand, we look foolish because we haven't fundamentally changed anything on the ground. And by the way, Colonel Gary Anderson wrote a pretty good article about the Marine Corps, explaining why the contemporary Marine Corps is not capable of moving to these points via sea, coming ashore, and rooting out the enemy. Because to be blunt, that is exactly what would be required if you really want to eliminate the Houthis and their capabilities. You've got to go in on the ground. Right now, it's over 50,000, and I think you have to include the naval forces at sea, as well as the air forces and Army ground elements in the region. We can expect at least 27,000 ground troops. He really would like to negotiate another agreement, which is also interesting since he jumped at the opportunity to throw the old one out. We'll see if it can be done. And then again, the wild card remains Mr. Netanyahu. What will he do? What will he tolerate? What will he reject? Because he's really running the show from behind the scenes. Tammy Bruce has done an excellent job of articulating the Israeli position. We used to try to be more even-handed if you go back a few years ago. There's no effort at that at all, no attempt whatsoever. I think there's a great deal of talk, but I don't see much evidence for action. And you're talking essentially about London, Paris, and Berlin. And in Berlin, they had to vote to change a provision in the basic law so that they could exceed their budgetary limits. Frankly, it's very hard to believe. Military power takes time to develop and grow. It doesn't happen overnight. On average, it's about 10 years. And so whatever you invest today, you will begin to see an impact provided the organization changes and adapts to the new technology in about 5 years. But you won't have the full impact militarily on a battlefield for perhaps another 5. So I'm a little skeptical. Plus, you've got to look at the financial realities. Britain's about to go under financially. France isn't far behind. The Germans are in a lot of trouble.
Yet there were very few Germans. And that, of course, was by design. All of this is nonsense. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just talking about propaganda. He's just repeating utter nonsense from the ruling class. They're in a lot of trouble in Great Britain. I don't think this ruling class is going to make it. They've been lying to their population about a whole range of things. Britain is a very nearly a boiling pot of discontent. So that's very important. And in the meantime, in this stupid tariff attack on most of all China and vacillating back and forth between attacking China economically and then making peace with it, we've made fools of ourselves, and we've demonstrated that in addition to no longer being the military power we once were, we're no longer the economic power we think we are. So these are the two great insights that are settling into the BRICS community. If you live in Japan, China, Korea, India, Iran, anywhere. It's hard to miss this. The people in Brazil haven't missed it. The people in most of the world haven't missed it. But this man in England completely fails to grasp it, as do too many people in Washington. President Trump needs to be the platonic figure who leads everybody out of the cave into the daylight. I just don't know if he can do it because he's torn and he keeps vacillating between one position and the other. My experience over the last 3+ years has been that the Russians have always told the truth. The Ukrainians have nearly always lied, and the United States and Great Britain and other Western outlets for the media, thanks to MI6 and CIA, have done everything in their power to disseminate the lies. So I'm sure the man's telling the truth. This is the sort of thing we tried in Georgia. The Russians intervened there militarily and killed it and put an end to it. We've tried to set up puppet regimes all over the place, ostensibly for the purpose of either harming or containing what we said was the dangerous state of Russia. All of this nonsense needs to come to an end. But I think the president is surrounded by people who are no less invested in the lie and the fiction than the man you just quoted. If you go through these people like Gorka and Waltz and Rubio, and others, my God, they live in a world that doesn't exist. It's all fiction. Let's stop for a minute and understand a couple of things that emerged from this Ukraine war that nobody else ever comes forward and mentions. Number one, what was demonstrated conclusively on the battlefield in Ukraine? What's being demonstrated conclusively is that NATO equipment, NATO military technology, which is in large measure American, is inferior to the equipment the Russians have brought to the battlefield. Secondly, NATO tactics, NATO operational art is stuck in the distant past. It's ill-suited to the modern battlefield. And the people that have paid the price for this, and the world began moving in directions that made sense, with great powers reemerging all over the planet that should reemerge. I'm very sorry for this Englishman, but the truth is England now is a very small, utterly foolish, and pretentious power. It doesn't seem to want to come to terms with the limits of its own resources and capabilities. And so it tries to claim control of ours through MI6 and through all sorts of other mechanisms and use us for their devices. This is not the British people. This is just this strange queer ruling class in England. Obviously, Zelensky is a criminal. He was a nothing comedian who spoke only Russian and had been raised in Russia, had no real connection whatsoever to Ukraine in any way, shape, or form, and was picked by one of the oligarchs and Victoria Nuland and the rest of these people to... This sort of thing goes on. Fox does it. CNN does it, all the mainstream media, because they're all part of the same cabal. In most cases, I think most of the people that want us to double down on failure in Ukraine want us to expand the war in the Middle East and go to war with virtually everyone in the region until the entire Middle East is subjugated to Israeli dominance and hegemony. So it's all part of the same thing. We've either got to wake up and dispose of these people and get them out because they present a clear and present danger to the survival of our country. If he wants to be effective, he needs to toss our friend Zelensky overboard along with his corrupt regime. And all of the senior military officers involved in this tragedy from the United States should be removed. Get rid of them. If you keep them around, they will continue to subvert whatever President Trump does. They will try to restore chaos and conflict wherever they can. So it's not just a question of Zelensky. What do you do about the people in the CIA and the Department of Defense who've done everything in their power to mire us in this quicksand? They've got to go away too. So he's got to understand this is a much bigger issue than just for President Trump has to be an effective leader at this point. That means that Zelensky's got to go. He's got to do the things that we've discussed. When you listen to Zelensky talk about what he demands of Russia, it's very similar to Mr. Netanyahu's demand for the Libyan solution for Iran. Netanyahu and Zelensky are of one mind. They both want the same thing, the complete and utter destruction of their opponents as a precondition for future peace and stability. So it's Zelensky's version of the Libyan solution. Now we've got the Netanyahu-Libyan solution waiting in the wings. Fortunately, I think President Trump stands a chance of getting out of Ukraine if he makes a decision. Again, he's the commander in chief. Everything is at his discretion. All of the aid going into Ukraine is at his discretion. Congress voted for it, but he has the ability, the authority to halt it at any point in time he chooses. And again, he's got to understand that he's not going to end up being popular with everybody. One of the things that I think President Trump wants to be is popular with everyone. That's not going to happen. It's never been the case for. That's where we need to focus, because Europe is just it's not trustworthy. It's not reliable. So on the one hand, I'm very hopeful that Mr. Witkoff comes up with something that is useful and can last. But on the other hand, I think the Russians have come around to understanding they can't bet on anything. How do they know that in 2 years or 3 years, somebody else shows up in the White House, the various lobbies pour in, and they buy up Congress and tell him we have to restore hostility to Moscow? I think that's what Mr. Putin's worried about. Yeah, it's very difficult to do business with us because there's just no stability, no certainty, and no rationality. Again, we're not sure from one day to the next how far we're willing to go. Now, this is the last point. This is very important. And I'm sure Mr. Witkoff is aware, maybe not, but President Putin gave some very important instructions and guidance, I would say, to all the leading economic leaders inside Russia in the context of BRICS, and talked specifically about us and the West. And he effectively said, the West is finished. We can't depend on anything from them. Whatever arrangements we make, we have to be self-contained and largely independent. We have to turn our attention to BRICS. That is economic relations and good business with everyone in BRICS: China, India, Iran, potentially in the future, most of Southeast Asia, I'd say probably most of Northeast Asia. That's where we need to focus, because Europe, I think that President Trump has yet to fully take charge of his own government and his own policies. If one looks at what he's been doing since he came in, for all the talk about finding an end to this war and taking stern measures to achieve that outcome, what have we seen? We've seen essentially an extension of the Biden policies. The money has continued to flow, and there's no demonstrable understanding of the origins of the war, its meaning, and what has to happen to end it. They've just consistently ignored whatever the Russians have said. Now, maybe Mr. Witkoff, the unappointed, unofficial ambassador, envoy, whatever they call him, has a different story to tell. I don't know. But right now, excuse me, it doesn't look good. And Zelensky in particular is someone that, frankly, should have been removed quite early. And people say, how could you do that? Well, you suspend all.
It has nothing to do with personalities or how much he likes or dislikes Trump. And ultimately, these people are gentlemen. They are absolutely polite. By the way, that's true in the Middle East as well. The Saudis, any of the people in the Middle East are not going to tell you to your face that they utterly hate and despise you and that you are a madman. They'll be polite and they'll try to talk in terms that we understand, that are not too blunt but tactful. I don't think we understand that. So Putin is not going to be intimidated in any way, shape, or form. Look, Russia is flush with victory in Ukraine. They can move in any direction at any time as far as they want to go. They've had setbacks, to be sure, over the last 3 years off and on, but they're in the driver's seat. They've got victory. More important, I would say, perhaps, is the demonstration of their technological superiority in military equipment, particularly in missiles, rockets, and so forth, as well as the superior performance and training of their soldiers. So this is not an inconsequential situation. Expecting the Russians to be intimidated by us when our equipment is performed badly, when the strategies and tactics that we have pushed on the Ukrainians, that's why I said earlier, he's ultimately in charge. He's determining everything, and his agents inside the government and the White House are determining everything that happens. So quite frankly, you're no longer listening to a truly independent American government. This is very much an Israel first administration. Might as well come to terms with that, understand what it means, which is unconditional support for whatever the Israelis want to do, regardless of whether or not that actually supports or harms our interests. Doesn't make any difference. That's the position. That's where we are. Tammy did a great job of taking the right positions from that standpoint and saying exactly the same things that you would have heard from any cabinet member. Doesn't make any difference. Everyone in this administration